14. Conor Chapman. Locals were innocently celebrating Christmas Eve at a pub in Wirral, England in 2022 when someone opened fire on the crowd using a submachine gun. The onslaught of bullets fatally struck a 26-year-old beautician named Elle Edwards, who was outside smoking a cigarette with some friends. At least 4 others were injured. Investigators determined that she wasn't the intended target. 2 of the men standing near were the intended targets of the shooting. The parties involved were entangled in an ongoing feud between local criminal gangs. It was an annual tradition for locals to gather at the pub on Christmas Eve. In all the years that Elle and her family and friends had been going there, no major violence had ever occurred. Authorities charged several suspects in connection with the deadly crime, but pointed toward 22-year-old Conor Chapman as the actual shooter. According to prosecutors, Chapman waited outside the pub for hours for the intended victims to step out. Phone records, DNA, and other evidence put him at the scene of the crime. A jury convicted Chapman of murder, attempted murder, and possession of a firearm and ammunition with the intent to endanger life. He was sentenced to life with a minimum of 48 years. 13. Tiffany Moore. Felicia Hester was just 19 years old when she was gunned down outside a nightclub in Elizabeth, New Jersey in 2011. Police found the young woman lying on the sidewalk with a bullet wound to the chest at around 2 o'clock in the morning. She was rushed to the hospital in grave condition and died 2 days later. Several days after the shooting, authorities charged 21-year-old Tiffany Moore with first-degree murder and 2 gun-related counts. At the time, she was already being held in custody on unrelated charges. According to court documents, Moore was a confirmed member of the Peru Gang Alliance, which is a subset of the Bloods gang. The circumstances of the shooting and whether it was gang-related are unclear. Moore took a plea deal and admitted to manslaughter in exchange for a 22-year sentence. She'll be eligible for release after serving 85% of the sentence, or 18.7 years. 12. Graham Potter. An Australian gangster named Graham Potter became the country's most wanted man in 2010 when he skipped bail on 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. He was accused of being hired to kill 2 men and was also wanted for his alleged involvement in trafficking $440 million worth of ecstasy. Potter has a mile-long rap sheet dating back to 1976, including a murder conviction he served prison time for during the 1980s. It wasn't exactly surprising that he didn't show up for court, but investigators probably didn't expect years to go by without being able to capture him. 6 months after he went on the run, Potter left behind a series of bizarre notes at a campsite in the remote town of Tully in Australia's far north. The messages detailed how he used various disguises to avoid being recognized in public, including fatsuits, wigs, and hair dye. He also found places to stay by befriending lonely elderly women. By the time law enforcement discovered the campsite, Potter had fled. The following year, he was pulled over for a routine traffic stop, but managed to speed away without being captured. It was the closest authorities would get to him for more than a decade, as they tried painstakingly to track him down. But information trickled in at best, despite a $100,000 reward being offered for tips leading to Potter's capture. In 2022, police received a tip that the fugitive was hiding out at an abandoned house in the far northern town of Ravenshoe. Officers and K9 stormed the crummy shack early in the morning and found Potter lying in bed. The fleeing felon initially tried claiming that the officers had the wrong man, but it quickly became clear that he was going to be arrested whether he liked it or not. The house was filthy and hoarded with junk and garbage, and Potter was disheveled. The 64-year-old looked like a man on the run, suggesting that it was getting difficult for him to survive as a fugitive. Potter remains in custody as the investigation into his alleged crimes continues. Authorities are also trying to piece together a timeline of his 12 years on the run. The court's currently in the process of determining whether there's enough evidence to go to trial, and the next hearing on the matter is in December of 2023. At the very least, Potter will languish in custody for a long time as the case drags its heels in court. 11. Killing for status. In December 2016, 28-year-old Crispin Colas got into an argument with 2 young men at a convenience store on Chicago's northwest side. He decided to move on from it and left the store in his vehicle. But the men he argued with didn't seem ready to let it go. According to authorities, they followed Carlisle in an SUV before pulling up next to him and shooting him in the head. The suspects remained at large for several months, during which time the shootings continued. 3 young men were killed, and at least 3 were injured in the unprovoked attacks, which occurred between 2015 and 2017. In a 2019 federal indictment, investigators identified the suspects as 26-year-old Hector Rojas, 25-year-old Jose Martinez, 21-year-old Santo Lozoya, and 22-year-old Pedro Navarro. According to prosecutors, the men were members of the Milwaukee King Street Gang. Santo Lozoya and Pedro Navarro were accused of being responsible for the murder of Golpes. To mark the occasion, they each got a tattoo beneath their eye depicting the logo of a bottle of liquor they bought that evening. Federal authorities charged the suspects with murder in aid of racketeering, and Navarro faced 2 additional counts of attempted murder in aid of racketeering. The men were accused of committing the violent acts in a bid to elevate their status within the gang. And they may have gotten some street cred, but they also got lengthy prison sentences. As the group's alleged mastermind, Navarro received the lengthiest term of 33 years. At some point in life, many people go through a phase where fitting in is one of their top priorities, and most of us grow out of it, but some don't. 10. Gioacchino Gammino. Modern technology is making it increasingly difficult for wanted criminals to hide from the law. New advances are even helping to lead to the capture of fugitives who've been on the run for decades. One such individual, an Italian mobster named Gioacchino Gammino, was captured in early 2022 after evading law enforcement for 20 years. Gammino was part of the Sicilian mob, also known as La Cosa Nostra. He escaped from a prison in Rome in 2002 while awaiting trial for murder, drug trafficking, and organized crime. If convicted of the murder charge, he faced a potential life sentence. According to investigators, Gammino most likely walked right out of the prison while a movie was being filmed there, taking advantage of the chaotic situation and slipping out unnoticed. Authorities were quick to add him to Italy's list of most dangerous fugitives. They hoped someone would come forward with information leading to his whereabouts, but it took almost 2 decades for a useful lead to emerge. Gammino was convicted of murder in absentia, and in 2014, Interpol issued a warrant for his arrest. In 2022, a tipster claimed that Gammino might be living in the Spanish town of Galapagar outside Madrid. The detective decided to look around the town using Google Maps Street View to see if he could spot a vegetable stand Gammino was rumored to own called El Huerto de Manu. He not only found the store, but saw the fleeing mobster himself standing right in front of the business. Further investigation revealed that Gammino previously owned a restaurant where he worked as a chef. The business had closed, but its TripAdvisor page still existed, and it featured a photo that showed Gammino working in the kitchen. The 60-year-old was shocked when law enforcement abruptly arrested him. He asked them how on earth they'd tracked him down, noting that he hadn't called his family in over a decade and had lived under various aliases. His main mistake was his failure to account for today's rapidly advancing technology, which assisted police while they also employed more traditional methods of investigating the case. After 20 years of living a new life as a different person, Gammino was returned to Italy to finish out his life sentence. 9. Matthew Dupre and Jean Lahrkamp. Thailand is notorious for its heavy-handed justice system and hellish prison conditions. And while this may discourage some foreigners from committing serious crimes, others are undeterred. Canadian national and alleged gangster Matthew Dupre allegedly falls into the latter category. Thai authorities are accusing the 38-year-old military veteran and another Canadian citizen, 36-year-old James Carlisle, of traveling to the country to murder a criminal gang member in early 2022. The victim, Jimmy Slice Sandhu, was born in India and raised in Abbotsford, British Columbia. He was deported back to India in 2016 due to his serious criminality. 2 years later, he was arrested for participating in a ketamine manufacturing operation. On February 5, 2022, Sandhu was shot dead roughly outside of his beachside villa on the island of Phuket, roughly 435 miles south of Bangkok. By the time investigators identified Dupre and Lahrkamp as the hooded men who killed Sandhu, the pair had returned to Canada. Authorities managed to track down and arrest Dupre, who remained in custody while the two countries negotiated his extradition. Lahrkamp died in a mysterious plane crash 2 months after Sandhu's murder while running from the law. At the time, he was one of Canada's most wanted men, with a $100,000 reward being offered for his capture. He was flying as a passenger on a small aircraft with another fugitive from British Columbia named Duncan Bailey, along with 2 pilots who had no criminal records. The plane crashed near Sioux Lookout, Ontario during the early morning hours of April 30th, 2022, killing everyone on board. According to investigators, Lahrkamp told his military friends that he was going to Thailand for an overseas job shortly before Sandhu's murder. He said that the gig was for a private military company but said little else about it. His law-abiding circle was reportedly shocked when they learned that Lahrkamp was a fugitive and an accused international hitman. Dupre was extradited to Thailand in May of 2023 after Thai officials agreed not to pursue the death penalty. He could have appealed the decision but didn't want to slow the case down. According to an online fundraiser seeking donations for Dupre's legal expenses, he's being held at a maximum security jail in Bangkok with a disturbing reputation while he awaits trial. Jean Lahrkamp's friends struggled to believe that a man they'd come to know as kind-hearted and peaceful was accused of committing a brutal murder. What's the most surprising, unexpected truth you ever learned about someone? Let us know in the comments below. 8. Hoang Oanh. In 2018, an unlikely suspect appeared on the Interpol's most wanted list in the form of an unassuming woman in her 60s named Hoang Oanh. The Vietnamese national is accused of heading a major international drug trafficking syndicate. Operating primarily out of the region where Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar meet, known as the Golden Triangle, Oanh's organization allegedly imported hundreds of kilograms of heroin, methamphetamine, and ecstasy into Vietnam. Organized crime runs in Oanh's family. Her sister, Dung Ha, was Vietnam's second highest-ranking crime boss during the 1990s. She was murdered by her rival Nam Cam, also known as the Godfather of Saigon. The two had once worked together to operate illegal gambling rings, but they became bitter enemies when their business relations soured. Interpol issued its wanted notice for Oanh during the first large-scale bust of her drug ring. Police seized dozens of kilos of meth, more than 100,000 ecstasy pills, and a large amount of heroin. 7 people were arrested, but by the time law enforcement moved in on the gang, Oanh had fled the country and was believed to be hiding out in Cambodia. She eluded authorities for 4 years while carrying on her illicit business, which included a trafficking route that transported drugs over the land border between Cambodia and Vietnam. According to Vietnamese officials, the traffickers hid the drugs inside the engine blocks of cars and drove the product to warehouses in various cities, including Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi. Acting on newly acquired intel in 2022, a task force of more than 100 police officers and military members took down the organization. Over 131 kilos of drugs were seized and 29 people were arrested, including Oanh. The case appears to be ongoing. 7. Alen Moradian. Nicknamed Sydney's Tony Soprano, Alen Moradian was one of the country's most powerful cocaine lords. He was also known for his extravagant taste and opulent lifestyle, which included a lavish mansion, first-class travel, luxury cars, and a mouthful of gold teeth. In fact, Moradian was allegedly such a show-off that he was scolded for it by his wife Natasha Yukana, who once told him in an email to be more low-key like Tony Soprano. She also accused her husband of wanting attention and signed off the note with an ominous warning, "People like that won't survive." Moradian was part of a secret cartel called The Commission, which has a powerful foothold in Sydney's drug trade, and he had connections with the Comancheros biker gang. In 2011, he pleaded guilty to his role in a cocaine trafficking operation and admitted to importing more than 40 kilos of the drug, although prosecutors insisted the amount was much higher. He was sentenced to up to 16 years in prison and was paroled in 2017. After his release, Moradian took his wife's advice and kept a lower profile. And while he managed to avoid any further legal trouble, his problems with rival gangsters reached their worst point following his release. Moradian went into hiding completely in 2022 after learning that there was a contract out on his life and that hitmen were actively searching for him. The news came directly from law enforcement officials who urged Moradian to move immediately and change his routine. Moradian sold his mansion, lived separately from his wife to protect her, moved from place to stay one step ahead of his enemies, and stayed off social media completely. The despised drug boss managed to evade the hitmen for 10 months. His life on the run came to an end in June of 2023, when he was fatally shot in the underground parking garage of an apartment building. He was sitting in a rented car when he was executed at point-blank range, taking so many bullets to the head that he was barely recognizable afterward. Killers are still at large. Following her husband's death, Natasha Buchanan told the Daily Mail that she faulted Australian authorities for not allowing Moradian to leave the country or even the state. To her, it didn't seem like an unreasonable request, considering the threat to Moradian's life and the fact that he managed to keep his nose out of trouble since his release from prison. He also had less than a year of parole left, but he remained confined to the region while other big-time organized criminals fled and fell victim to rising violence between gangs. Buchanan said that she believed Moradian would still be alive if he'd been allowed to relocate to somewhere far away. There was heavy security at the fallen gangster's funeral, which authorities had cautioned reporters against attending due to the risk of violence. The police presence was also heavy, with multiple patrol cars driving laps around the church, plainclothes officers in attendance at the service, and a unit of undercover officers stationed nearby. Since then, Sydney's remained plagued by gang-related shootings. Authorities are insisting that they haven't lost their control over the streets, but people are beginning to question these claims that the violence continues with no end in sight. Some people might agree that Moradian should have been allowed to flee Australia in order to save his life, while others would argue that he created his own problems by being a career criminal. 6. James Jim Carlisle. 42-year-old Irish career gangster James Jim Carlisle had over 170 criminal convictions under his belt by the time he was accused of trying to kill his romantic partner in 2023 by dousing her with lighter fluid and lighting her on fire. He was arrested for the crime while he was out on bail and awaiting sentencing for an attack on another woman over an alleged drug debt. The victim of the previous attack, Olivia Creaney, told the Sunday World that she'd never met Carlisle before the night he assaulted her in 2021. It all started when thugs showed up at her door looking for her cousin. The cousin wasn't there, and the gangsters threatened to burn Creaney's house down and harm her family if she went to the police. Creaney was left with multiple facial fractures, a broken nose, internal head bleeding, and was blinded in one eye. Carlisle had a long history of victims dropping charges because they were afraid for their safety. But sooner or later, he was bound to cross paths with someone who refused to back down to him. Olivia Creaney was that person. Wanting to set an example to her children about not tolerating abuse, Creaney stood by her case against Carlisle, and he ultimately pleaded guilty to grievous bodily harm, assault, intimidation, and possession of a knife. After the more recent attack on his partner, Carlisle was held on an attempted murder charge at Margaberry Prison, Northern Ireland's only maximum security correctional facility. 2 weeks later, he was found dead in his prison cell. Authorities have ruled out foul play. Carlisle's criminal history dates at least as far back as 2001, when he was accused of murdering a teenager named Peter McNally. And for decades, he managed to weasel out from underneath serious criminal charges. In the McNally case, he pleaded guilty to a lesser charge and continued his life of crime. Over the years, Carlisle became a henchman for Malcolm McCown, a notorious crime boss who was murdered in 2019. In 2012, Carlisle and McCown were accused of murdering suspected drug-dealing couple Hugh and Jacqueline McGough. The case was dropped in early 2013, despite Carlisle allegedly being linked to the crime through DNA. And while the judge said it may not be the end of the matter, neither he nor McCown were ever prosecuted for the double murder. Karma came knocking in 2016, when Carlisle was shot 4 times by a rival gang member. He survived after taking 2 bullets to the chest and 2 to the arm. Despite the fact that he may have gotten away with murder and was lucky enough to escape death at least once, Carlisle's lifestyle amounted to little more than a legacy of violence with a sad ending. It serves as a sobering reminder of how being a gangster usually isn't as glamorous as people often think. 5. Zara Panitzke. A British woman named Zara Panitzke was on trial for her alleged role as the leader of a fraud gang when she went on the run in 2013. The court proceedings continued during her absence, and she was sentenced to 8 years in prison. According to authorities, Panitzke illegally resold cell phones from abroad and laundered the profits through companies in Andorra and Dubai. 17 other defendants were convicted and sentenced to prison time for their roles in the operation. Panitzke is the only one who went on the run. In 2015, police tracked her down outside Barcelona in the Spanish town of Olivella. But Panitzke somehow got word that law enforcement was on her trail, and she changed her appearance and fled before they could arrest her. After realizing that investigators may have located her through her family ties in the region, she distanced herself from her relatives. The search continued for years with no luck until early 2022, when police received a tip that Panitzke might be living in the town of Santa Barbara. After conducting weeks of surveillance, detectives felt confident that they'd found the fleeing fugitive living on the outskirts of town. They arrested Panitzke while she was outside walking her dogs and extradited her back to the UK to serve her sentence. In a statement, National Crime Agency spokesman Tom Dowdall speculated that Panitzke might have thought enough time had passed for authorities to stop searching for her. He cautioned the public to think of the case as a reminder of how British law enforcement will not rest until a fugitive is captured, no matter how long it takes. 4. Edgardo Greco. Many people don't realize that there's more than one Italian mob. The one most commonly spoken of is the Sicily-based La Cosa Nostra, but there are multiple other powerful gangs with very similar mafia-like structures. One of them is the 'Ndrangheta, which has had a global presence since the 1950s. It's one of the world's most powerful criminal organizations. Founded in Calabria, the group's crimes center mainly around drug trafficking, but the organization also dabbles in gun trafficking, money laundering, racketeering, extortion, loan sharking, prostitution, and other crimes. 'Ndrangheta member Edgardo Greco vanished in 2006 while facing trial for a double murder he was accused of committing 15 years earlier during a violent mafia war in the Calabria region. Greco allegedly beat brothers Stefano and Giuseppe Bartolomeo to death outside a fish market and dissolved their bodies in acid. A court convicted him of the crime in absentia and sentenced him to life in prison. Greco remained untraceable for years as investigators searched for even the slightest trace of him. In many cases, authorities locate fugitives through their communications with their families. But he didn't contact anyone in his family, including his wife and 2 sons. At some point during his time on the run, Greco relocated to the French city of Saint-Étienne, where he lived under the alias Paolo Demetrio. Law enforcement finally began to make progress in their search for Greco in 2019, when they began tracing his support network. Their suspicions that he was living in France were confirmed when they came across a newspaper article from 2021 featuring Greco as the owner of a new pizza restaurant. Despite his use of an alias and the fact that he hadn't been seen in 16 years, the investigators recognized him in a photo that was featured with the article. Like most organized criminals who were captured after years hiding from the law, Greco's capture was rather uneventful, probably because he wasn't expecting it and was caught with his guard completely down. Once he was taken into custody, authorities began the process to extradite him to Italy, where he'll resume his prison sentence. 3. The Felony Lane Gang. In 2010, a theft and identity fraud ring called the Felony Lane Gang originated in Florida. It operates mainly by having its female members steal purses from women while the men commit smash and grab robberies. Members use these stolen IDs and credit cards to write bad checks, go on shopping sprees, and commit other crimes. The gang's name was inspired by the tendency for its female thieves to wear wigs and use bank drive-through lanes that are furthest from the window, so they're difficult to see. According to the FBI, the Felony Lane Gang has a big online presence. Law enforcement's fine with this because it makes their job of identifying and catching criminal suspects much easier than it would be otherwise. As of 2020, the Washington, D.C.-based Felony Lane Gang Task Force had arrested around 1,500 members across the United States. A large portion of the investigative work is carried out using Facebook, where suspects tend to throw caution to the wind when it comes to their publicly posted content. Instagram is also a popular platform among FLG members. In 2019, 3 women were arrested in Indiana for thefts that were committed in Georgia after posting photos on the network, along with captions daring federal investigators to do their job. And in some cases, informants have pointed authorities in the direction of FLG members who were using social media under nicknames. A 40-year-old Detroit woman named Christina Smith was busted after posing for Facebook photos in the same sunglasses she allegedly wore while fraudulently cashing checks at banks. She was apprehended alongside another FLG suspect named Jamar Dukes, who was also identified through the use of social media. Smith reportedly collected $150 for every $1,000 check she successfully cashed. While the FLG may have a tendency to overshare online, every gang has its strengths. This one specializes in high-speed chases, mainly because its members know that in many places, police won't pursue a subject at high speed unless they're confident that the person is an imminent threat to public safety. Factions of the gang also tend to travel, going on interstate crime sprees rather than staying in any given place for too long. As of 2023, the FLG remains in operation amid law enforcement's continued efforts to dismantle the organization. Some of the most recent news reports have warned the public that the gang has reappeared in Syracuse, New York, and southern New Jersey after a hiatus from the areas. The FLG is especially prevalent along the East Coast and along I-75, which runs from Florida to the very top of Michigan along the Canadian border. It doesn't seem like the group's going to be shut down anytime soon, and authorities are warning civilians to keep a close eye on their belongings to avoid becoming the next victim. 2. Modern-day grave robbers seek revenge. George Morogi immigrated from Iraq to Australia at a young age with his family. He grew up outside Melbourne, where he fell in with the wrong crowd and became a career criminal by the age of 16. Since then, he's spent no more than a year at a time outside of jail. In 2019, Morogi founded a crime syndicate called the Notorious Crime Family. The gang abided by a code of 19 commandments, including a strict ban on using certain drugs and a willingness to support other members in all circumstances, right or wrong. As the organization's leader, Morogi headed major drug and fraud operations. Today, he's in a maximum security prison for murdering a rival drug dealer in 2016, and he's not getting out anytime soon. In addition to receiving a 32-year sentence for the murder, Morogi was sentenced to 16 years for continuing to run his drug operation from behind bars. Since being convicted of his crimes in 2020, he spent nearly 24 hours a day in isolation. In 2021, the Kingpin's younger sister, Michelle Morogi, died from COVID-19 complications. She was just 30 years old. Michelle is credited with playing a key role in her brother's rise to the upper echelons of the criminal underworld. While George was unable to attend the funeral because he was in prison, Michelle was given the type of lavish burial one might expect a gangster's family member to be laid to rest in. Members of a rival organization took gang warfare to a new low in 2023 when they broke into the mausoleum where Michelle was buried in the middle of the night. In what appears to be a body-snatching mission gone wrong, they dragged Michelle's coffin out of place and smashed it open, but left her body there after discovering that the elevator to the ground floor was out of order. The botched grave robbery came during an uptick in violence between Australia's Middle Eastern gangs. And while gang rivalries can get ugly, desecrating the grave of an enemy's loved one is not a normal occurrence, even for a man like George who's probably created more enemies than he can probably count. It's been widely seen as an ultimate show of disrespect, and authorities are reportedly worried that the violence between gangs will escalate. No arrests have been made in the case, and the investigation is ongoing. 1. Raffaela D'Alterio. It's uncommon for women to become members of the Italian mafia, let alone rise to a position of leadership. But as the daughter of a mob boss, you could say that it was in Raffaela D'Alterio's blood. In addition to being born into organized crime, she married into it. So, it was only natural for her to step in and take the reins after her husband Nicola Pianese was fatally gunned down in 2006. Many believe that D'Alterio killed her husband in a bid to end an ongoing mob war. Nicknamed A Micchiona, or the Big Female Kitten, D'Alterio was in charge of highly profitable drug cartels that operated out of Naples under a cell of the Camorra mob. In 2009, mobsters targeted her in a shooting out of jealousy over her power and wealth. She survived and continued to run her organization's illicit businesses. The shooting came at a time when the local mob, the Camorra, was at war with the notorious Sicilian mafia, La Cosa Nostra. While the Sicilian mob is the better known of the two parties, the Camorra has a long-standing reputation for being more ruthless and violent. Over a 30-year period from 1982 to 2012, the Camorra allegedly killed more than 4,000 people. D'Alterio's criminal career came to an end in 2012 when she was busted for extortion, robbery, drug dealing, and possession of illegal weapons. She and several of her associates were accused of squashing competition with rivals through the use of violence and intimidation. Prosecutors claim that D'Alterio also sought to expand her cell's power by strengthening her ties with other Camorra leaders. At the time of D'Alterio's arrest, mob-related shootings were a daily occurrence in and around Naples. Altogether, 65 people went down in the bust as part of a ramped-up effort to curb the gang violence in the streets. Raffaela and several of her associates were reportedly sentenced to hard time and have remained largely out of the spotlight ever since.
Number 15. Carla Diaz Torrealba. Also known as La Pelua and La Granuda, or the Hare in English, Carla Diaz Torrealba was known for posting seductive selfies on social media. She was often seen posing with guns in scantily clad outfits, but it wasn't all for show. The young woman was one of the most trusted associates of Venezuelan mob boss Carlos Luis El Coco Revete, who operates out of the country's capital, Caracas. According to local media reports, Torrealba used her feminine wiles to lure rival mob bosses to their abductions. As one of El Coco's top-ranking lookouts, she naturally fell into the path of law enforcement as they attempted to close in on Revete in July of 2021. By that point in time, Revete had been wanted for over a decade. There was a $500,000 reward being offered for his capture, yet he managed to evade the authorities time and time again. Such was the case during the attempt to catch him in 2021. During a days-long shootout with hundreds of Special Forces officers, El Coco once again slipped through the hands of the police, while Torrealba was taken into custody. All things considered, the confrontation could have ended much worse for the young woman. At least 33 people died in the melee, and there were rumors of police executing suspects on the spot. The glam gangster's current whereabouts and activities are unclear. Torrealba has remained largely absent from news headlines ever since her arrest, suggesting that perhaps her short-lived career as a professional gangster has come to an end, although it's entirely possible that she's simply keeping a low profile. Number 14. The murder of Rosa Sanchez Marino. Mara Salvatrucha, better known as MS-13, is notorious for carrying out some of the most gruesome and horrific acts of gang violence the United States has ever seen. One of the most recent examples is the brutal murder of an 18-year-old woman named Rosa Sanchez Marino, who was killed around May 1, 2023, in Montgomery County, Maryland. The case remained unsolved until late September, when 23-year-old Roberto Rivera Delgado was taken into custody in Nevada for a parole violation. He was extradited to Maryland and reportedly led detectives to Sanchez Marino's body. Rivera Delgado and 3 other suspects were subsequently charged with first-degree murder, including 23-year-old Iris Alonso Salgado and 21-year-old Araceli Abarca Melgar. According to authorities, Rivera Delgado drove his accomplices to a wooded area in Olney, where they led the victim into the forest and forced her to her knees. The group proceeded to take turns slashing Sanchez Marino's neck with a machete before tossing her body into a shallow grave. All 4 suspects are being held without bail pending the outcome of their cases. Number 13. Daniel Medaglia. In 2009, a New Jersey man named Daniel Medaglia saw a potential opportunity to fulfill his long-held dream of joining the Italian mafia. He did this by impressing his new friend, Michael Dupre, who bragged about having connections to the mob. More specifically, Dupre claimed to be an underboss to his uncle Paulie, who supposedly headed the Genovese family. He also told Medaglia a wild story about being kidnapped by a rival gang and held captive in a storage unit in Staten Island, and claimed that he had shortened his last name from Docesa to evade law enforcement and enemies. In reality, Dupre had no mafia connections whatsoever. He wasn't even Italian, but he went out of his way to keep up the ruse, including by introducing Medaglia to people he claimed were hitmen and loan sharks, and by calling him from blocked numbers pretending to be an old Italian man. On another occasion, Dupre allegedly made Medaglia wait outside while he went around the corner to carry out a drug deal for hundreds of pills with a fellow mobster. Dupre offered Medaglia a way into the family in 2011 when he identified Medaglia's good friend Kelvin Dumo as an alleged snitch who needed to be taken care of. At one point in time, the 3 men had worked together as pill dealers. The trio split after Dumo was arrested for drugs and realized that Dupre was lying about being connected to the mob. When Dupre offered to use his connections to get the charges dropped in exchange for $500, Dumo declined. By that point, Medaglia was fully convinced that Dupre was a genuine gangster. He tried persuading Dumo to accept Dupre's help, but it didn't work. Believing Dumo was a rat, Medaglia lured his longtime friend to a marine terminal in Sayreville and murdered him with a pickaxe. The police were quick to narrow in on Medaglia as the suspected killer and Dupre as the alleged mastermind. Finally realizing that his friend wasn't in the mafia, Medaglia accepted that he had made a life-ruining mistake and pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison and part of a deal in exchange for his testimony against Dupre, who also faced a murder charge. Taking the stand in his own defense, Dupre claimed that his fake mafia stories were a complete joke and that he never had serious intentions to harm or kill anyone. He said it was shocking how gullible Medaglia was, and while it was funny at first, it eventually became a chore to keep up with Medaglia's fascination. Dupre even said that he tried convincing Medaglia that it was all a joke, only to be met with a response to the effect of, I know, the mafia isn't real, with a wink and a nudge. In 2017, Dupre was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. He won a new trial in 2020, but remains incarcerated as of late 2023. Number 12. Latia Henderson and Kaylee Ketley. In early 2021, a 24-year-old Australian woman named Nisha Phillips was kidnapped by 2 wannabe girl gangsters who she thought were her friends. After getting into an argument during the early morning hours, 18-year-old Latia Henderson and 24-year-old Kaylee Ketley stabbed the young woman as she begged for mercy. The suspects ignored Nisha's pleas to stop hurting her and forced her into the trunk of her own car while threatening to kill her. They then took a joyride and filmed Snapchat videos showing no concern for the victim's well-being as they sang along to the radio and smoked marijuana. Nisha attempted to stem the bleeding of her wounds using a shoelace as a makeshift tourniquet. At one point, her captors pulled over, stabbed her some more, and then continued driving around, making her feel even more convinced that Ketley and Henderson were going to make good on their threats to murder her. As she drifted in and out of consciousness, Nisha found the strength to continue fighting for her life. She managed to bust out one of the car's rear tail lights and stuck her hand through the hole, waving frantically in an attempt to alert other motorists to her need for help. A police officer spotted Nisha's hand and pulled the vehicle over and asked the suspects who was in the trunk. The women played dumb, acting as if they had no clue someone else was in the car, but the officer didn't buy it. He rescued Nisha, who told him she had been taken hostage after her friend's behavior went from 0 to 100 during a trivial disagreement. Henderson and Ketley initially pleaded not guilty to a litany of crimes, but they each ended up admitting to numerous charges in exchange for getting certain counts dropped. During their sentencing hearing, Henderson expressed remorse for her actions, which she blamed largely on childhood trauma, while Ketley's attorneys argued that she suffered from mental health issues. But the women's social media pages also showed an apparent affinity for the gangster lifestyle, with posts featuring pictures of guns, flashy cars, and hardcore rap lyrics. The court sentenced Henderson to 7.5 years, with the possibility of parole after 5 years, while Ketley received an 11-year sentence, with the requirement to serve more than 6.5 years behind bars. Number 11. Robin Wilkin. According to those who knew him, Irish truck driver Robin Wilkin had an obsession with organized crime. He reportedly had links to British gangs dating back to the 1990s and had a history of working as an enabler for London-based drug-selling groups. One fellow trucker told the Irish Sun that Wilkin talked a big game but could never back up his claims. The aspiring gangster also tried to form business relationships with powerful people, but many avoided associating with him. Wilkins was most recently arrested in 2021 when he allegedly tried to smuggle millions of dollars worth of cocaine across the famous Channel Tunnel among a shipment of Belgian chocolate. The arrest may seem like proof of his gang ties, but smuggling is low-level work, indicating that he was the designated fall guy for more important career criminals who were unwilling to risk getting caught. Wilkins was due to stand trial in October 2023, but he was found dead in July after being beaten and thrown off some cliffs in County Donegal. He had been reported missing several days earlier after he was last seen enjoying live music at a pub and driving away with a man and a woman shortly after midnight. The trio seemed relaxed in surveillance footage from the bar. 38-year-old Alan Vile and a female suspect are being held in custody on suspicion of murder as they await their next court date. For now, authorities are remaining tight-lipped about the circumstances surrounding their alleged involvement in the case. Number 10. Ryan Fortescue. After separating from his wife of 18 years in 2016, 44-year-old Canadian paramedic Ryan Fortescue began dating a 29-year-old woman named Brady Elizabeth Cara Lavadior. He soon became a methamphetamine user for the first time, and within the next year he began catching criminal charges for financial crimes, including forgery, theft, and fraud. Fortescue's downward spiral took a visible turn in 2018 when he and his girlfriend were accused of stealing hundreds of pieces of mail. They skipped court and law enforcement soon came knocking. During a raid on Fortescue's home in Manitoba, police found a sawed-off shotgun beneath Fortescue's bed. The weapon was wrapped in clothing supporting the Hells Angels, and officers found some other support gear throughout the home, including Hells Angels t-shirts. Lavadior was found hiding in the back of a hollowed-out sofa, and a couple were arrested on a multitude of charges, including gun-related counts. Following the arrest, Fortescue lost his job. He would later express deep remorse for ruining his career, claiming he no longer thought it was cool to wear Hells Angels gear. Yet he continued to glorify the group in his social media posts following his arrest. In 2021, Fortescue pleaded guilty to one count of unlawfully possessing a firearm. During a pre-sentencing interview, Fortescue's ex-wife described the defendant as a wannabe who was obsessed with organized crime throughout their marriage. She said Fortescue thought it was cool and liked the television shows and brotherhood of it. The wannabe biker was sentenced to 2 years of house arrest and 3 years of probation. During his sentencing hearing, the judge noted a concern over his unusual fascination with organized crime, but believed he did not pose a danger to the community under supervision. According to the Winnipeg Free Press, Fortescue has reportedly focused on turning his life around and now works as a painter and drywaller. Number 9. Ahmed Suhad Ahmed. In 2017, a drug-addicted heroin user from Arizona named Ahmed Suhad Ahmed tried to finance his habit by telling people he knew how to build bombs. He offered his skills to a confidential FBI informant posing as a Mexican drug trafficker who claimed they wanted to kill a rival cartel member with an explosive device. The informant introduced Ahmed to a friend who happened to be an undercover FBI agent, and the three traveled to Las Vegas, where Ahmed built 2 bombs and explained how to operate them. Not long after that, Ahmed was arrested on federal charges for heroin possession and distributing information related to explosives. In court, his defense attorney Walter Gonsalves argued that the defendant used his Middle Eastern background to his advantage, claiming he learned how to construct the devices during the Iraqi war, when in reality Ahmed had Googled the instructions for how to make a bomb. Gonsalves depicted his client as a wannabe gangster who resorted to desperate measures to fund his drug and alcohol addiction. But the prosecution was quick to point out that Gonsalves acted with the understanding that he was arming a dangerous person who wanted to commit a murder. Ahmed pleaded guilty to the charges and was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. The judge also ordered him to undergo substance abuse treatment and offered a stern caution that if Ahmed fell back into drugs, he would end up back in the courtroom and that the judge would send him back to prison. Number 8. Albert Rapowski. A drug-fueled gathering of wannabe thugs took a deadly turn in 2016 when one of the young men accidentally shot his friend in the face. 20-year-old Albert Rapowski and his buddies were partying at a hotel room in Melbourne during a night that seemed to begin innocently enough. At some point, they decided to pose for photos in their underwear with a sawed-off shotgun while trying to act like gangsters. One of the attendees, 22-year-old Mohammed Hassan, urged Rapowski to unload the gun to avoid an accidental discharge. A group member removed 2 magazines from the gun, but nobody took care to ensure that it was fully unloaded or that the safety was on. While pointing the gun at Hassan's head for a selfie, Rapowski accidentally pulled the trigger. The bullet struck Hassan in the mouth and neck area, killing him instantly. Rapowski panicked and fled the scene. He got rid of the gun, which was never found, and tried fleeing to Macedonia, telling a travel agent that he needed to travel urgently to his sick grandmother. Border officials apprehended him at the airport, and he eventually pleaded guilty to manslaughter. Rapowski hadn't slept in 4 days and was reportedly high on GHB and methamphetamine at the time of the incident. For this reason alone, he should have known that he was in no condition to operate a gun, according to the judge, who described the defendant's actions as nonchalant and arrogant. According to Australian news outlet The Age, Rapowski also did not have a gun license and did not know how to properly use the weapon. The judge further criticized Rapowski for leaving the scene, noting that he had a moral duty to stay even though there was nothing he could do to help Hassan. But he was credited with being genuinely remorseful and for having good prospects of rehabilitation, earning him a sentence of 8 years with the requirement to serve at least 5 years in prison. Number 7. Jordan McSweeney. 35-year-old aspiring lawyer Zara Aleena was walking home after a night out in London in June of 2022 when a stranger viciously attacked her from behind. The assailant pulled her into a driveway and assaulted her as she fought for her life. After kicking, stomping and beating the victim for 9 minutes and returning several times to continue the attack, he fled the scene. A couple found Aleena struggling to breathe as she lay dying on the pavement. The young woman died from her injuries despite the best efforts of Good Samaritans and emergency responders, who spent more than an hour trying to save her life. Nearly 50 injuries were identified on Aleena's body, including blunt force trauma to the head, bruising to her face, and deep cuts to her scalp. She also suffered from a traumatic brain injury. Police identified the suspect as Jordan McSweeney, a habitual offender with dozens of convictions on his record. His rap sheet included priors for burglary, assaulting police, and racially motivated crimes. He had a disturbing history of violence against women and had recently been released from prison when he murdered Aleena. On the night of the killing, he was kicked out of a bar for harassing a female employee. He proceeded to follow 4 more women before committing the fatal attack. In the years leading up to Aleena's murder, 2 of McSweeney's ex-girlfriends accused him of domestic violence. One of the women, Samantha Bryan, described the accused killer as a wannabe gangster who stomped on her so hard that he left his shoe print on her face. She endured McSweeney's abuse for 4 years before she finally escaped. Bryan reported her ex to the police, but ended up dropping the charges against him. She told the Daily Mail that she just couldn't follow through with the case, but said she regretted failing to do so after learning about Aleena's murder. 6 months after the brutal slaying, McSweeney pleaded guilty to assault and murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 38 years. Number 6. Colin Coates. During the late 1990s, highly successful Scottish IT specialist Colin Coates was overtaken by the same type of arrogance that plagues many people who might be considered new money. Also, like many wealthy young people, he began drinking a lot and developed a cocaine habit. This combination of factors led to an explosive temper and abusive tendencies, and as a result, Coates lost all the trappings of his success, including his celebrity hairdresser wife and most of his hard-earned fortune. Over the years, Coates was arrested for beating up his wife, attacking a fan of a rival sports team at a pub, and assaulting his sister-in-law and a good Samaritan who intervened. He was also suspected of burning down his ex's house, but the case was dropped due to a lack of evidence. During a flight to Spain in 2009, Coates erupted into a cocaine-fueled tirade, announcing that he was a gangster and spewing threats at innocent passengers. He threatened to burn one woman's house down and to throw acid in another woman's face. Coates made off with just a fine, but it was not the last time he would grace news headlines for his outrageous behavior. A few months after the plane incident, Coates befriended Lynda Spence, a serial fraudster who touted the false image of a successful businesswoman. Desperate to restore the wealth he had lost so he could go back to living an upscale lifestyle, Coates scrounged up some of the little money he had left for a property investment that Spence promised would come with a big payout. But the return never came, and in April 2011, Coates realized he had been fleeced. Determined to exact revenge, he lured Spence to his flat where he and a co-conspirator named Philip Wade were waiting with a sinister plan. The men forced Spence into the attic, bound her to a chair, taped her mouth shut, and forced her to wear a pair of glasses with the lenses covered with tape. Over the next 2 weeks, the men subjected Spence to prolonged torture, using bolt cutters, a golf club, cigarettes, a clothing iron, and other objects to inflict excruciating pain. They smashed Spence's knees, cut her thumb off, and inflicted other agonizing injuries in hopes of getting her to reveal what she had done with Coates's money. Coates and Wade summoned the help of 2 additional men who stood guard over Spence in between torture sessions. They eventually killed Spence, and her body was never found. After the murder, the men deep-cleaned Coates's apartment in an attempt to get rid of evidence, but they missed a spot of blood, which tested as a positive DNA match to Spence. During the suspect's trial, witnesses testified that they were intimidated into remaining silent about what they knew. The men who stood guard over Spence for Coates and Wade claimed they were afraid to release the victim because they feared what the suspects might do to them. Meanwhile, Coates denied having any involvement in the victim's disappearance, even though all signs pointed to the contrary. He claimed that he had provided Spence with a safe house to stay at when people were after her for conducting bad deals, and that she just vanished one day. Coates was found guilty of kidnapping and sentenced to 11 years in prison. When he finally confessed to Spence's murder, he offered to help authorities locate her remains, causing her loved ones to get their hopes up about the possibility of finally giving her a proper burial. But a search of the location Coates provided turned up empty-handed, and authorities have failed to identify a promising location for a second search, leaving the victim's family to grapple with an ongoing lack of closure. Number 5. Luke Gould. Throughout 2014 and 2015, a teenage British man named Luke Gould committed a string of violent crimes against innocent victims in Cheshire, England. In one incident, Gould pointed a realistic-looking BB gun at a teenage victim in the town of Runcorn. In a scene later described by a judge as resembling a horror film, the young man tripped and fell while attempting to escape on foot. Gould and his co-conspirator chased after the victim and held a fake firearm to his head, then began pistol whipping and stomping on him. When 2 bystanders tried to intervene, Gould turned the gun on them and threatened to blow their heads off if they called the cops. The victim later told police that he thought the suspects were going to kill him. He suffered a broken nose and ended up needing stitches for his injuries. Less than 2 months later, Gould and another accomplice tried to rob 2 brothers using the fake gun. Instead of backing down, one of the victims grabbed Gould by the throat, punched him in the face, then lifted him up and slammed him into the ground. As he fled with his tail between his legs, Gould fired the BB gun, striking the other victim in the midsection. During police questioning, Gould and his buddy claimed that one of the victims produced the gun, but the weapon was found in Gould's yard, and he was charged accordingly in connection with the crime. He skipped his court date and proceeded to commit 5 robberies over the next several months, while on the run. In July 2015, Gould threatened a store clerk with a machete. The victim was so traumatized he sold his business. Gould also stole a bicycle from a teenage boy he robbed at knife point and held a blade to another victim's throat during another armed robbery. Police eventually found the suspect hiding under his bed cover. During questioning, Gould claimed that voices in his head had egged him on to commit the crimes. His attorney told the court that his client suffered from mental health and substance abuse problems and that he had started smoking weed as a child. In 2016, Gould pleaded guilty to 2 counts of having an imitation firearm with the intent to cause fear of violence, assault causing actual bodily harm, perverting the course of justice, and 5 counts of robbery. While handing down a life sentence with a minimum of 6 years, the judge administered a stern caution that the teen would not be released from custody unless he is deemed to no longer be a threat to society. If and when he sees freedom again, he'll spend the rest of his life on probation. Sure enough, Gould served a handful of years and was cut loose, only to become wanted again in 2023 for violating the terms of his release. As of April 2023, he remained on the run and was believed to possibly be hiding out in Wales. Number 4. Harry Sonny Hamonda. A falling out between 2 young men from Cardiff, Wales spiraled out of control in early 2021 when one of the parties decided to take their behavior to a criminally threatening level. Harry Sonny Hamonda and Ryan Matthew Storm were once close friends, but they became entangled in a petty tit-for-tat for reasons that were never revealed and began exchanging nasty messages on WhatsApp. At some point, Storm blocked Hamonda in an attempt to put the feud to rest. But Hamonda wasn't ready to let it go and began harassing Storm through social media. The fight went on for months before Hamonda sent Storm a video of himself shooting what appeared to be a gun out his car window while driving. Before pulling the trigger, he uttered a threat to his former friend, using slang to refer to the gun. During a search of Hamonda's home, police found a large amount of marijuana and 2 legally owned airsoft guns. After determining that the gun in the video wasn't a real firearm, authorities charged Hamonda with drug possession with the intent to sell and having an imitation firearm with the intent to cause fear of violence. He pleaded guilty and received a suspended prison sentence along with community service. Hamonda was also ordered to undergo rehabilitative treatment and was banned from contacting Storm for 5 years. The judge minced no words while handing down the sentence, describing the defendant as a naive idiot rather than a real gangster. Number 3. Mason Armsden McLennan. In November 2018, an 18-year-old British man named Mason Armsden McLennan and an accomplice violently robbed a pair of party guests at a flat in Leicestershire, England. Armed with machetes, the young men cornered the victims on a balcony and forced them to strip down to their underwear. The thieves stole the victims' clothing, shoes, a watch, a cell phone, and the keys to an Audi, which they used as a getaway car. During the robbery, Armsden McLennan allegedly told the terrified victims that they had crossed onto his turf and they didn't belong in the area. The stolen Audi was later found abandoned and damaged beyond repair. In a previous robbery a few months earlier, the teen made similar comments after asking a friend to give him a ride somewhere during the early morning hours. During the drive, Armsden McLennan began making comments like, "I'm the boss around here, and this is my estate." He tried to choke the victim, who briefly fell unconscious, and threatened him with a screwdriver before speeding off in the man's car, which was never found. Armsden McLennan was young, but he already had a lengthy rap sheet detailing numerous failed court interventions, which were carried out in an attempt to straighten out his wayward behavior. Despite these failed efforts, the defendant claimed during his trial for his most recent batch of robberies that he truly wanted to change. Yet he couldn't even handle hearing the truth about himself from the judge, who asked Armsden McLennan if his crimes were worth it and told him to stop bullying people. The troubled teen lashed out, telling the judge that he hoped he died and calling him an inappropriate name. He was sentenced to 7 years in a youthful offender facility. Number 2. Azim Issa. A British man who was known for calling himself a gangster on social media lost his temper on an epic scale while playing video games with his friends one day in April 2016. 22-year-old Azim Issa wanted to play an Ultimate Fighting Championship game, but his buddies wanted to play a FIFA soccer game. To get Issa to stop whining, the friends gave him a marijuana joint. Issa was probably already in a bad mood over not getting his way when his pals mocked him for losing a match against 28-year-old Sahil Roy. Several days later, he dropped by Roy's house in London. They were hanging out like normal when Issa allegedly got upset with Roy for refusing to give him a cigarette. The men soon began exchanging "your mom" insults. Issa apparently took Roy's commentary to heart and lost his temper, fatally stabbing Roy twice in the head and neck with a switchblade. He then fled the scene, while Roy bled to death and was later charged with murder. In court, the prosecutor accused Issa of seeking out Roy, who appeared to be avoiding him after their argument a few days before. Issa argued that Roy charged at him in a fit of rage and that he had stabbed his friend in self-defense. But it was Issa's temper and his habit of carrying a knife that the judge blamed for the deadly altercation. Number 1. Kai Conor. Before he decided to become a real criminal, 19-year-old Kai Conor shared photos and videos of himself wearing a balaclava and acting tough with guns and machetes on Snapchat. The following month, he led law enforcement on a high-speed chase in Manchester, England, while driving a BMW with fraudulent license plates. He blew red lights and drove erratically, forcing other drivers to veer out of the way to avoid being hit. Officers managed to stop the car after chasing the teen for 10 minutes, prompting Conor to flee on foot, tossing a machete along the way. During a search of Conor's home, police found a gun, ammunition, and gun cleaning kit stashed in the backyard, along with marijuana and painkillers. Investigators also searched his sister's phone, which contained internet searches for things like how to remove fingerprints from a gun. And of course, police found Conor's collection of photos and videos of himself trying to act like a gangster. The teen's DNA was found on the weapon, and Conor was found guilty of drug and gun possession. He was sentenced to 5.5 years in prison and banned from driving for nearly 3 years. Conor's sister, Amy Patterson, was sentenced to 1 year of supervision, including 3 months on an ankle bracelet with a curfew, and was ordered to complete 25 days of rehabilitative activity.